The rescue ships from the Galactic Consortium arrived 3 days too late. The human colony ship New Geneva lay scattered across the frozen wasteland of Kithra like broken toys, its hull split open and spilling the content of human dreams into the deadly cold. Commander Veltar stepped through the wreckage with practiced indifference. His species, the Velthani, had been conducting rescue operations for over 1,000 years. They knew the drill: save the valuable species, leave the rest. Life signs, Commander, his aide reported, scanning the twisted metal with thermal sensors. 17 survivors detected. Species identification? All humans, sir. Veltar's mandibles clicked in disgust. Of all the species in the galaxy, humans were the most persistent. Like weeds, they seemed to grow anywhere, adapt to anything, and refuse to stay dead when more civilized species would have the decency to give up. The Consortium had been very clear about their stance on humans. Aggressive, short-lived, technologically primitive, a waste of resources to save, and too dangerous to let multiply across the galaxy. Better to let nature take its course. Standard protocol, then. Veltar decided. Marked the site as investigated. No survivors found. They moved through the wreckage with efficient brutality. The adult humans were already dead from the crash impact. A few children had survived in the emergency pods, but the sub-zero temperatures of Kithra would handle them within hours. No need for Consortium to dirty their hands. Then they found the baby. The infant was maybe 6 months old, tucked inside an emergency life pod that had kept him alive for 3 days. His skin was dark, his eyes bright brown, and his lungs worked perfectly as he screamed his defiance at the frozen world around him. Someone had wrapped him in every piece of cloth they could find before the crash, and somehow, impossibly, he was still fighting. This one still got some life in him. The aide noted, checking his scanner. Core temperature is low but stable. Remarkable resilience for such a primitive species. Veltar looked down at the crying infant and felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Not compassion exactly, but a kind of professional curiosity. Most species would have died within the first few hours. This small human had survived 3 days in conditions that would kill most adults of more advanced races. Sir? Orders. The baby looked up at Veltar with those impossibly bright eyes, tears freezing on his cheeks, but still crying, still fighting, still refusing to give up. Cave system, 2 kilometers north. Veltar decided. The cold will finish what the crash started. More, natural that way. They carried the infant to the ice caves that dotted Kithra's northern ridge. The caverns were beautiful in their way, filled with crystalline formations that caught and reflected light like frozen stars. It would be a peaceful place to die, Veltar reasoned. Better than the twisted metal of the crash site. They left the baby in the deepest chamber, still wrapped in his makeshift blankets. The infant's cries echoed off the crystal walls, growing fainter as the rescue team walked away. Mission log. Veltar dictated as their shuttle lifted off from Kithra's surface. Colony ship New Geneva investigated. No survivors detected. Recommend system be marked as cleared for mining operations. Below them, the ice world spun silently in the void, keeping its secrets. In the crystal caves, a human baby cried alone in the darkness, his voice growing hoarse but never stopping. Each breath created small puffs of steam in the deadly cold. Each cry was an act of pure defiance against a universe that had already written them off as worthless. The Consortium ships departed, their mission complete by their own standards. They had followed protocol. They had done their duty to the galaxy's established order. They had left no witnesses to complicate their official report, but they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated the most dangerous thing in the entire galaxy, a human child who refused to die quietly. Hours passed. The baby's cries grew weaker, but never stopped completely. His small body fought against the cold with every ounce of strength his species was famous for. The same stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had carried humans to every corner of their home galaxy now burned in the chest of one abandoned infant. Deep beneath the ice, something ancient stirred at the sound of those cries. Something that had been sleeping for centuries, healing from wounds that should have been fatal, dreaming of better days when the galaxy knew the meaning of honor. The cries echoed down through layers of crystal and stone, reaching ears that had not heard the voice of innocence in 300 years. In the thermal depths of Kythera, golden eyes opened for the first time in centuries. The last dragon in the galaxy was waking up, and she was not pleased with what she was hearing. Deep beneath the frozen surface of Kythera, in chambers that had been carved from living rock millions of years before the first consortium ship ever flew, something magnificent began to stir. The thermal vents that kept the planet's core alive also kept her alive, feeding heat into scales that shimmered like captured starlight. Pyraxis had been sleeping for 3 centuries. Not the gentle sleep of smaller creatures, but the deep hibernation of dragons, where time moved like honey and wounds that would kill gods slowly healed. She had earned this rest. The scars across her massive form told stories of battles fought when the galaxy was young, when dragons served as guardians of all life rather than legends whispered in dark corners. But now something was pulling her from that healing sleep, a sound that cut through centuries of silence like a blade through silk. Crying, not just any crying, but the specific, desperate wail of a child in mortal danger. Every dragon knew that sound. It was burned into their very souls, an instinct older than civilization itself. No matter what species, no matter what world, the cry of innocence and peril called to them like nothing else in the universe. Her golden eyes snapped open for the first time in 300 years. The thermal chamber around her began to glow as her internal furnaces ignited. Each scale on her massive form shifted from deep purple to brilliant gold as ancient bioelectric systems came online. At nearly 200 feet from nose to tail, she was death incarnate to most species in the galaxy. But to children, to the innocent and helpless, she had always been something else entirely. She was salvation. Moving through the underground passages she knew better than her own heartbeat, Pyraxis followed the sound of crying. Her massive claws, each longer than a grown human, moved with surprising grace across the crystal formations. Steam rose from her nostrils as her body temperature climbed toward its full power. The crying was coming from above, from the cave systems that honeycombed Kythera's upper crust. As she climbed through passages carved by ancient thermal vents, the sound grew stronger, more desperate. Whatever child was making that noise was dying, and dying fast. When she finally reached the crystal chamber where the consortium had left their burden, what she found made her ancient heart burn with rage. A human infant, barely 6 months old, lay wrapped in inadequate cloth scraps on the freezing stone floor. His dark skin had taken on the blue tinge of severe hypothermia, and his small body shook with each labored breath. But still he cried, still he fought, still he refused to surrender to the cold death that surrounded him. Pyraxis had seen many species in her long life. She had watched civilizations rise and fall, had seen the birth and death of stars. But in all her millennia of existence, she had never encountered anything quite like human stubbornness. Here was a child who should have died hours ago, whose species was supposedly primitive and weak, yet who continued to rage against extinction with every fiber of his being. Without hesitation, she curved her massive form around a tiny human, creating a living wall of warmth against a deadly cold. Her scales, each one a small furnace, began to radiate heat that turned the icy chamber into a comfortable nest. Steam rose from melting frost as her body temperature warmed the air around them. The baby's cries softened as life-giving warmth seeped back into his small body. When he opened his eyes and looked up at her, Pyraxis felt something she hadn't experienced in centuries. Not just a protective instinct that all dragons shared, but something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, or destiny. Those brown eyes, bright with intelligence despite his ordeal, seemed to look right into her ancient soul. Here was a child who had been abandoned by his own species' rescuers, left to die in the cold because someone had deemed him worthless. Here was innocence betrayed by the very beings who should have protected it. The rage that filled Pyraxis in that moment could have melted mountains. She knew the consortium's ways. She had fought their predecessors in the old wars, had seen how they treated species they deemed inferior. But to abandon a child, to leave an infant to freeze to death in darkness, that was a depth of cruelty that even her ancient cynicism hadn't prepared her for. "What have they done to you, little flame?" she whispered in the old dragon tongue, her voice like distant thunder. The baby's small hand reached out and touched one of her massive scales. The gesture was trusting, innocent, completely without fear. He had no idea what she was, no knowledge of the terror her kind once struck into the hearts of galactic armies. To him, she was simply warmth, safety, and the end of his long nightmare of cold and abandonment. In that moment, Pyraxis made a decision that would reshape the galaxy. "I will call you Damon," she said, the name coming to her from some deep well of ancient memory. "And I swear by the fires that burn at the heart of stars, you will never be cold again. You will never be abandoned again. You will grow strong, little human. And when you are ready, we will show this galaxy what happens when innocence is betrayed." The last dragon in the known universe had found her purpose again, not as a weapon of war or a creature of legend, but as what she had always been meant to be: a guardian, a protector, a mother to the abandoned and forgotten. And the galaxy would never be the same. 15 years passed in the thermal caves beneath Kithra's surface, and in that time, something extraordinary happened. The abandoned human baby grew into something the galaxy had never seen before, a young man raised by dragons, taught by ancient wisdom, but driven by pure human determination. Damon stood 6 feet tall now, his dark skin healthy and strong despite never seeing natural sunlight. The thermal caves had become his entire world, a maze of crystal chambers connected by passages that Pyraxis had carved with her claws over the centuries. Each room served a purpose. The library chamber, where holographic displays showed him the history of 100 worlds. The workshop, where he tinkered with salvage technology from the crashed colony ship. The training hall, where Pyraxis taught him combat techniques that predated the consortium by millennia, but was in the main chamber warmed by underground thermal vents where the real magic happened. This was where dragon and human truly bonded, where ancient knowledge met human creativity in ways that surprised even Pyraxis herself. "Tell me about the old days again," Damon said one morning, working on a piece of consortium technology he'd salvaged from the wreckage above. His hands moved with practiced skill, rewiring circuits that most engineers would need years of training to understand. Pyraxis settled her massive form around the chamber's perimeter, her golden eyes watching her adopted son work. Which old days, when dragons ruled the thermal worlds, when the first starships learned to bend space, or when your people first looked up at the night sky and decided they belonged among the stars. The last one, Damon grinned, not looking up from his work. "I like that story." The dragon's rumbling laugh filled the chamber. "Humans, even then, even when you barely understood fire, you looked at infinity and said, 'That's where we're going.' Every other species in the galaxy learned to accept their limitations. Your people learned to ignore them entirely. It was true, and both of them knew it. Over the years, Pyraxis had shared the real history of the galaxy with Damon. Not the sanitized version the consortium taught, but the truth. How humans had spread across their home galaxy not through conquest or superior technology, but through sheer stubborn refusal to stay put. How they had adapted to environments that killed other species. How they had looked at problems that stumped ancient civilizations and solved them with creativity that bordered on insanity. "The consortium fears you," Pyraxis had explained when Damon turned 13 and started asking harder questions. "Not because you're violent. Not because you're primitive. They fear you because you don't accept the word impossible." Damon had proven that truth every day of his life. By age 8, he had figured out how to repair the cave's failing heating system using parts from a crashed ship and techniques Pyraxis had never seen before. By 10, he was building communication devices that could reach 3 star systems. By 12, he had created weapons that made even his dragon guardian raise an eyebrow in surprise. "How did you know to crosswire the power coupling like that?" Pyraxis had asked, watching him modify a consortium plasma rifle into something far more dangerous. "I didn't know," Damon had shrugged. "I just tried stuff until something worked." That was pure human logic right there. No extensive planning, no careful calculation of risks. Just try stuff until something works. It drove every other species in the galaxy crazy, but it got results that no amount of careful engineering could match. Now, at 21, Damon had grown into something that would have terrified Consortium if they'd known he existed. He spoke 17 galactic languages fluently, understood stellar engineering better than most professionals, and could jury-rig solutions to problems that stumped experts. But more than that, he had inherited something from his dragon guardian that made him truly dangerous. He had learned to think in centuries instead of years. "We can't stay hidden forever," Damon said, putting down his tools and looking at the long-range scanner he'd built from salvage parts. "The mining surveys are getting closer. 3 ships this week, all heading toward our sector. Pyraxis had been dreading this conversation for years. The consortium's expansion into the outer systems was inevitable. Kithra had resources they wanted, and eventually they would come to claim them. When that happened, staying hidden would become impossible. If we run," she said carefully, "we can find another world, deeper in the outer rim, where they'll never think to look." Damon shook his head, and in that gesture Pyraxis saw the stubborn determination that defined his entire species. Running just means more people suffer. More children get abandoned in frozen caves. More species get ground down because a consortium decides they're not worth saving. You're one person, Little Flame. Even with my help, we cannot fight an entire galactic government. "Maybe not," Damon admitted, pulling up star charts on his homemade holographic display. "But we don't need to fight all of them. We just need to show the galaxy what they really are, what they've been doing to anyone who doesn't fit their perfect little system." He turned to face his guardian, his brown eyes burning with the same fire that had kept him crying in the frozen cave 21 years ago. The same refusal to give up that had carried his species to the stars. "You taught me that dragons were guardians once, protectors of the innocent. But you also taught me that humans don't wait for permission to do what's right." He gestured toward the scanner readings. "They're coming whether we're ready or not. So let's be ready." Pyraxis looked at the young man she had raised from an abandoned infant and felt something she hadn't experienced in centuries. Pride, not just in his growth or his skills, but in his character. He had every reason to hate the galaxy that had left him to die. Instead, he wanted to save it. "Very well," she said, her voice carrying the weight of ancient oaths. "Then we prepare for war." But as she watched Damon smile that dangerous human smile, Pyraxis realized they weren't preparing for war at all. They were preparing to save a galaxy that didn't even know it needed saving. And that was the most human thing of all. The consortium mining fleet arrived at Kithra on a Tuesday morning, local time. 12 ships, 300 soldiers, and enough firepower to level a small moon. They came expecting to find an empty ice world ready for strip mining. Instead, they found something that would haunt their nightmares for the rest of their lives. Commander Veltar stood on the bridge of his flagship, older now, but still carrying the same arrogant certainty that had served him well for decades. He'd almost forgotten about Kithra entirely until the mining surveys detected unusual energy readings from the northern ice caves. Probably just thermal vents, as scientists had said, but protocol demanded investigation. "Sir, we're detecting artificial heat signatures from the cave systems," his scanner operator reported. "Looks like someone's been living down there. Pirates, most likely," Veltar decided, "or smugglers using the caves for storage. Standard sweep and clear operation." But as the landing parties descended toward the crystal caves, they found something far stranger than pirates. The ice around the cave entrances had been carved into intricate patterns, almost artistic in their design. The passages themselves showed signs of long habitation, with primitive but effective heating systems jury-rigged throughout the tunnels. "Sir, you need to see this," came the voice of Strike Team Alpha over the comm. They had reached the main chamber, and what they found defied every assumption they'd made about this mission. The chamber was massive, carved from living rock, and warmed by thermal vents. But it wasn't empty. Scattered throughout the space were pieces of technology that made Veltar's engineers stop and stare. Communication arrays that shouldn't have worked, but clearly did. Weapons that looked like Consortium standard issue, but had been modified in ways that hurt the brain to contemplate. And in the center of it all, a young human male working calmly at a workstation, as if armed soldiers bursting into his home was the most natural thing in the world. "You're late," Damon said without looking up from his work. "I expected you 3 days ago." The strike team leader stammered into his comm, "Sir, we have a situation down here." Veltar descended to the caves personally, bringing half a security force with him. What he found waiting in that crystal chamber made him question everything he thought he knew about the universe. The human was tall, dark-skinned, and moved with the quiet confidence of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. He looked to be in his early 20s, well-fed and healthy despite living in what should have been a frozen wasteland. But it wasn't a human that made Veltar's blood run cold. It was a dragon. She emerged from the shadows like something out of ancient nightmares. 200 feet of scaled depth that should have been extinct for millennia. Her golden eyes burned with intelligence older than Consortium itself. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of eons. "Hello, Veltar," Pyraxis said, her voice like distant thunder. "Do you remember me? Or perhaps you remember him?" She gestured with one massive claw toward Damon, who had finally turned away from his workstation to face the assembled soldiers. When Veltar looked into those brown eyes, something cold settled in his stomach. There was something familiar about that face, something that tugged at memories he'd tried to bury. 21 years ago, Damon said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made hardened soldiers step backward. "You found a crashed colony ship on this world. You found survivors. 17 of them, to be exact." The memory hit Veltar like a physical blow. The crashed ship, the dead humans, the infant in the emergency pod, crying in the frozen wreckage. "Impossible," he whispered. "You died. The cold, no one could survive." "You're right," Damon nodded. "No one could survive what you did to me. No one except someone with a very special guardian angel." Pyraxis moved then, not attacking but simply repositioning herself, so that her massive form surrounded the chamber. Every exit was blocked by scales harder than starship armor. Every soldier in the room suddenly understood what it meant to be prey. "I want you to know something," Damon continued, walking closer to Veltar with the casual confidence of someone who held all the cards. "I spent years wondering why you left me to die. I thought maybe it was incompetence, maybe cowardice, maybe you just didn't care." Around the chamber, Consortium soldiers were discovering that their weapons weren't working. Electromagnetic pulses, timed perfectly, had disabled every piece of military hardware in the room. They were surrounded by an angry dragon and a human who had apparently spent 2 decades preparing for this exact moment. "But then I learned the truth," Damon said, stopping just within arm's reach of the commander who condemned him to death. "You didn't leave me because you thought I was worthless. You left me because you were afraid of what I might become." Veltar's translator was struggling to keep up with his panic stammering. "The protocols we followed, standard procedure," Damon repeated, and for the first time, anger crept into his voice. "Standard procedure that just happens to eliminate any species that might pose a threat to Consortium dominance. How convenient." He pulled out a datapad and activated a holographic display that filled the chamber with star charts, shipping logs, and classified Consortium documents. Evidence of systematic suppression spanning centuries. Records of species left to die when they could have been saved. Orders to abandon colonies that showed too much promise, too much independence. "You want to know what humans are really good at?" Damon asked, gesturing to the display. "We're good at remembering. We're good at learning. And we're really, really good at holding grudges." The data he compiled over years of hacking Consortium networks painted a picture that made even the soldiers sick. Not random cruelty, but calculated elimination of potential rivals. The Consortium hadn't been maintaining order in the galaxy. They'd been maintaining their own supremacy by crushing anyone who might challenge it. "So here's what's going to happen," Damon said, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had spent 21 years planning this moment. "You're going to sit down, shut up, and listen while I explain to the entire galaxy exactly what kind of monsters you really are." Behind him, Pyraxis smiled, revealing teeth the size of swords. Around the chamber, Consortium soldiers slowly realized they were witnessing something that would change the course of galactic history. The abandoned human child had grown up, and he was ready to settle accounts. But what terrified Veltar most wasn't the dragon or the disabled weapons, or even the damning evidence displayed around them. It was a look in Damon's eyes. Not hatred, not rage, but something far more dangerous. Justice. Cold, patient, and absolutely inevitable. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when you left a human child to die in the cold. The transmission began at exactly 14:27 Galactic Standard Time, and within minutes, it was being broadcast on every major communication network across 7 galaxies. Damon had spent years building the most powerful broadcast array in known space, jury-rigging consortium technology with human ingenuity and dragon-taught engineering. When he activated it, his signal punched through every firewall, every security protocol, every attempt to shut it down. The galaxy stopped what it was doing and listened. "My name is Damon," he began, standing in the crystal chamber with Pyraxis behind him and 300 terrified consortium soldiers as his audience. 21 years ago, your government found me as a baby in the wreckage of a crashed colony ship. They had a choice: save an innocent child or leave him to freeze to death in a cave because his species wasn't worth the effort. The holographic display behind him showed the evidence he compiled over decades. Ship logs, classified orders, records of systematic abandonment that painted consortium not as galactic peacekeepers, but as something far more sinister. They chose to let me die, but they made one crucial mistake. They underestimated what happens when you abandon a human child in the presence of a dragon. Across the galaxy, beings of 100 different species watched in stunned silence as the camera panned to show Pyraxis in all her terrible magnificence. Dragons were legend myth, creatures from the dark ages before the consortium brought order to the stars. Seeing one alive, protective, and clearly allied with a human sent shockwaves through every government in known space. But it was what happened next that truly changed everything. Within hours of the broadcast, responses began flooding in from across the galaxy, not from governments or official channels, but from individuals, from the forgotten corners of space where the consortium's influence barely reached. The first response came from the Kepler mining colony, where a small community had been struggling to survive after being officially declared economically non-viable by consortium planners. Their message was simple: we're still here, we're still fighting, and we're not alone. Then came the Zephyrian nomad fleets, broadcasting from deep space. The young human speaks truth. We have hidden in the dark between stars for 3 centuries, keeping our children safe from consortium mercy. No more hiding. The flood became an avalanche. Human colonies that had been presumed extinct revealed themselves on dozens of worlds. They had not just survived in the harshest environments imaginable, but thrived. Underwater cities, in the crushing depths of water worlds, floating habitats in the storms of gas giants, underground warrens in the hearts of asteroids. Everywhere the consortium had declared uninhabitable, humans had not only lived but built entire civilizations. "Look at what they accomplished," Damon said during his second broadcast 3 days later, sharing footage of human settlements that defied every rule of engineering the consortium thought absolute. While you were told humans were too primitive to save, they were terraforming moons with nothing but scrap metal and determination. While you were told they were too violent to trust, they were building peaceful communities that welcomed refugees from a dozen different species. The revelation shattered the consortium's carefully constructed narrative. For centuries, they had justified their actions by painting humans as dangerous primitives who needed to be contained for the good of galactic peace. Now the galaxy could see the truth. Humans weren't confined because they were dangerous. They were confined because they were inspiring. But the real earthquake came when other dragons began to surface. Pyraxis had sent out a call through channels that predated the consortium by millions of years, and her ancient kin had answered. They emerged from hidden lairs across the galaxy, magnificent beings who had been thought extinct for millennia. Each one carried the same message. They had been watching, waiting, protecting the innocent while the galaxy forgot they existed. The dragon Kethmora broadcast from the water world of Atlantica, where she had been secretly protecting human settlements for 2 centuries. We never abandoned our duty as guardians. We simply chose to guard those who needed us most. From the crystal caverns of Zirion came Pyraxis' oldest surviving clutch sister, Velandra. The consortium may have forgotten what dragons truly are, but we have not forgotten our purpose. We are the shields of the innocent, the guardians of the abandoned, the last hope of the hopeless. Commander Veltar, still imprisoned in the crystal chambers of Kythera, watched his life's work crumble in real time. Emergency sessions of Consortium Council devolved into screaming matches as member species demanded answers. How had they allowed this deception to continue for centuries? How many innocent species had they condemned to death in the name of maintaining order? The breaking point came when 3 entire star systems announced their withdrawal from the Consortium and their intention to form a new alliance with the human colonies and their dragon guardians. The Tau Ceti independence movement, led by a coalition of species the Consortium had written off as economically insignificant, declared that they would no longer bow to a government that measured worth in credits and resources rather than the value of life itself. Damon, now speaking as the unofficial voice of growing rebellion, made his final broadcast from the Senate chambers of New Geneva, a massive space station that human refugees had built in secret over the past 50 years. "We don't want to rule the galaxy," he said, looking directly into the camera with the same brown eyes that had once cried alone in a frozen cave. "We don't want revenge against those who abandoned us. We want something much more dangerous than that." Behind him stood representatives of dozens of species, with Pyraxis' magnificent form visible through the massive viewport that showed the stars beyond. "We want justice. We want a galaxy where no child of any species is ever left to die alone in the cold. We want a future where worth is measured not by profit margins or political convenience, but by the simple fact that every thinking being deserves a chance to live, to grow, to reach for the stars." The camera pulled back to show the incredible sight of the New Geneva station, a massive structure built from salvaged Consortium ships, human ingenuity, and materials freely shared by species Consortium had dismissed as worthless. It was a symbol of what could be accomplished when beings work together instead of trying to dominate each other. The old galaxy is ending, Damon concluded. A new one is being born, and this time we're all invited to help build it. The transmission ended, but its effects rippled across the galaxy for months. The Consortium government collapsed within a year, replaced by a loose confederation of free worlds dedicated to cooperation rather than domination. Dragons took their place once again as guardians and protectors, working alongside humans and dozens of other species to explore new worlds and defend innocent. And in the crystal caves of Kythera, where it all began, a memorial was built to remember a simple truth. Sometimes the most powerful force in the universe is a child who refuses to stop crying in the dark, and the guardian who answers that call. The galaxy had learned to listen.